Today I'm going to show you how to create a material design ripple type of effect in NativeScript using just CSS and animation. No external dependencies. Coming up in this video. What's going on? This is Alex Ziskind. I teach NativeScript courses on nativescripting.com. If you want to learn more about NativeScript, click on the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss anything. After my last animation tutorial, linked down below, you've asked for more animation tutorials. Surprise, surprise. So here we are. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a ripple type of effect on buttons, but you can apply this technique to other elements like cards or other UI structures. The animations are going to be essentially the same. Another benefit to this is you'll have consistency between iOS and Android. There is one catch though. Well, not really a catch. You don't have to install any dependencies. All right, well, this tutorial is a little bit on the longer side, so grab a coffee and let's go. I'm going to use the NativeScript CLI to create a new project called Demo Material Ripple. And I'm going to give it a TSC flag, so it just scaffolds out a NativeScript core project with TypeScript. And once it's done, let's go into that directory. I'll open this up in Visual Studio Code. There it is. And I'm also going to kick it off in the iOS simulator. Okay, while that's starting up, let's take a look at the code. Now, I am going to use the main page XML and the main page TS, but I don't need the view model here, so I'm going to delete it. You saw some more files show up. That's because we're building this in the background. Now, let's go to mainpage.xml and clean this up just a tiny bit. There we go. Back to our mainpage.ts file. Let's see. I don't need any of this stuff. You know what? I'm just going to delete everything. There we go. All right, so what do I need here? I'm going to keep around the stack layout, and I'm going to remove these labels and keep this button in here. Okay, so there's our tap button. For the tap event, we're not data binding anymore to the view model, so I'm going to remove the data binding syntax. That means we need this on-tap handler in our code. And I'm going to remove these classes just for a little bit here. So let's create this on-tap handler back here. Export function on-tap. I'm just going to make it print out to the console tap event. That way we can keep track of our tap event to make sure we don't lose it, because that's important for a button. We don't need this navigating to event on the page either, so let's remove that. And we can keep the action bar around. So now we have the stack layout and a button inside of it. Let's save everything and take a look at what we have. Here is our iOS simulator with the tap button there, and I can tap it. And on the console, you'll see that we have the message tap event printed out right there. So this is our starting point. What do we need to do here? We want to have this ripple effect, right? So I'm going to leave this button as is right here, just so we have a reference point. And I'm going to create another stack layout in here so we can have a few buttons that we're working on. And I'm going to make this one oriented horizontally. And inside here, I'm just going to copy a button, paste it in here. This is the button I want to make with my ripple effect. The first thing I'm going to do is add a class to my button so I can control its styling. So I'm going to create a class called button, and I'm going to go to app.css. Let's delete everything out of here too, and create a class called button here. I want to control the width and the height of my button, first of all. We want to do this so that we can calculate dimensions precisely. That way we can create that ripple effect inside of it using specific dimensions. So I'm going to create the width of 100 and a height of 30. Let's specify the margin to be 0 and padding to be 0 as well. Now, in order for us to have a ripple effect on this button, we need to add a circle. That's right, a ripple is just an animated circle that expands outward from the position where you tap it. But a button cannot have child elements in NativeScript. So we need to somehow position a circle on top of a button or underneath a button, whichever it may be. We're going to do on top, and the way we position things absolutely in NativeScript is using the absolute layout. So I'm going to wrap the button with an absolute layout, and I'm going to give my absolute layout a class. Let's call it button wrapper. So this will essentially become a button. The whole thing will be considered as a button. Even though the button is actually inside the layout, we're going to think of the whole thing as a button. So let's go in here, and right at the top, I'm going to create the class button wrapper. What's important here is that your height and width are exactly the same. So let's go ahead and copy this and paste it here. So the width is 100 and the height is 30, just like the button. If I change the button to be 200, I'm going to have to change the button wrapper to be 200. Now you could also do it a different way. You can share a class, right? You can say button dimensions, right? And then you can add just the height and the width into button dimensions. And then you add button dimensions to the absolute layout and the button, as well as some other styling classes. You can try that yourself as well. That'll work. But here we'll just use two different classes. Now I want to give this button some color too. So because this button is going to be see-through, and on iOS by default, a button, it doesn't have a background color. It's see-through, it's transparent. On Android, it's a little bit different. So we're going to handle Android separately. But on iOS, our button doesn't have a color. So if we want to have a color for a button, I'm going to apply it to the absolute layout. On the absolute layout, I'm going to add another class called button red. This will give us a red button. Let's go to our app.css, and I'm going to create a class called button red. And here I'm going to create a background color red, but I don't want it to be that red, so I'm just going to use my little color picker here and go to something like this. And because I made the button background color red, I'm actually going to give the button itself a color, so the text on the color is white. If we take a look now, you'll see that we have a button here. It's got a red background and white text. Let's go ahead and do some taps here. You can see that the tap handler still works on the button, and we get that button highlighted effect on iOS as well when I tap. Great. Now you can activate the ripple when you first touch the button before letting go, or when you let go. Either way, I'm going to do it when we put our finger down on the button. And the way we differentiate between down and up is by using the touch event on the button. So I'm going to set up a touch event. I'm going to call the handler onTouch. Let me just give us a little bit more space to work with. Okay, so now I need to handle this onTouch event. Let's go to the code and export function onTouch. This is going to get us some args, and this is of type touch gesture event data. There it is right there. I'm just going to select it, and it's going to get auto-imported by Visual Studio Code. We can import it from TNS Core Modules UI gestures. I don't need that second gesture, so I'm going to delete it. And now I'm going to just quickly check args.action. And I only want to proceed if args.action is down. So if it's not down, then I'm just going to return from this function. And if it is down, I'm going to proceed. Args.object is going to give us the button itself. So we need to store that in a variable. I'm going to call that btn. But here, it's actually an observable. We want to cast it as a button. We can cast it as a button, or actually what I'm going to do is cast it as a view. Since buttons inherit from views, I'm going to use the more generic view class. The view class is going to give me all the functions I need later on, so I'm just going to use that. And that gets imported from TNS Core Modules UI page, but actually I want to import it directly from TNS Core Modules UI core view. We're also going to get a reference to the layout that wraps the button, this absolute layout right here. I'm going to save it off as a wrapper. And the way we do that is we look at the button itself, and then we look at its parent. And this one I'm going to cast as layout base. That gets auto imported from TNS Core Modules UI layouts layout base. Great. We'll be using that in a little bit. So my next task is to create that circle that's going to expand. But I need to know what size to make it and where to position it. So as far as size, I'm going to create this circle the same size as the button. And the reason I'm doing that is so we can calculate the border radius properly. First things first, let's create the circle itself. And the circle, I'm just going to make it out of a label. There is no shape in NativeScript, so you can't just say, I want to create a circle. Not yet, at least. So you have to create something that's a view, and the easiest view to manipulate with dimensions and colors is a label. Now, there is such a thing as a content view in NativeScript, like this. I've tried content view. It doesn't behave the way I want it to. It doesn't turn into a circle. So I'm going to create a constant called circle, and it's going to be a new label. Let's go ahead and import label from TNS Core Modules UI label. And for the circle, we need to set a few things. We need to set its width. We need to set its height. I'm going to add this circle to the absolute layout. So because it's positioned absolutely, it's going to need to be positioned, right? So we're going to need to have a top on it, and we're going to need to also have a left on it. I also want to set its background color. You can set whatever background color you want. I'm going to use white because it's going to be very visible. Initially, I want it to be hidden, so I'm going to set the opacity to 0. But before I do that, let's set the opacity to 1 so we can actually see it on the screen. We'll change that in a minute. So how do we obtain the dimensions for the circle? Well, we need to get the dimensions of the button, but the button could be any size, right? So it could be taller than it's wide. So I first have to get the button height and the button width. So const button height, and that's going to be button.height. But button.height gives us this %length type, which is actually a number. So I can't really use math functions on it though, because it's a different type than a number. So I'm going to force this to be a number by using the number constructor like that. And const button width is also going to be forced to a number. We're going to read button width. Now the reason I needed these to be numbers is because I want to calculate the larger of the height or width. So let's call it D, and I'm going to use math.max, and I'm going to grab button height and button width, and this is going to give me the larger of the two, so I can make the circle that size. So the width of the circle is going to be D, and the height of the circle is also going to be D. Now as far as positioning, let me comment that out for a second. Let us take a look at what we have so far. Oh, you know what? We're not going to actually see anything until we add that new label to our wrapper, which is the absolute layout. So wrapper.addChild circle. Now I'm going to save this and we'll take a look. Okay, so when I tap this, you see that it gets completely covered by the circle. So we can't really see anything here. If we are to see anything, let me go ahead and temporarily make the width D divided by 5. And actually I need to set the border radius here too. And I'll set that to D divided by 2 because the border needs to be 50% of the actual dimension in order for it to be a circle. So in this case, temporarily, I'm going to set border radius to D divided by 10. I'll switch this back in a second. This is just so we can see what's going on. I'm going to tap this. Okay, and we get a little circle in there. Good, good, that's good. But notice I tapped it on the right side and the circle appeared on the left. So that means we're not positioning the circle properly yet. So let's go back here. I'm going to remove this divided by 5 and the border radius should be D divided by 2. Now let's position the circle properly. And the way we do that is we need to have a little calculation. Let's go back up here for a second. This touch gesture event data has some more information on it that's useful for us. Specifically the position where we touched. So args dot get x and get y is what we're going to use. So let's use get x. I'm going to store that in x. And in the y constant, I'm going to store get y. Once we have x and y, we can go down here to circle top. And circle top is going to use the y coordinate. We want to place the center of the circle where we tapped. That's the y coordinate. But to get the center of the circle, we have to subtract D divided by 2. And for left, we can use the x coordinate. Also, we have to subtract D divided by 2 here. Excellent. So if I go here now to the app, I tap here on the right side and you can see that our circle covers sort of the right side. And let me just make a quick change so our app restarts. I'm going to click on the left side this time. There we go. Our circle kind of centered around the left side. So good. It looks like it's positioning it properly. Now for the fun part, the animation itself. So we've created this circle, which is the size of the actual button, but we want it to be small to start out with. So we're going to use a set of chained animations to do that. Our main animation is actually going to be that growing circle, but in order for it to grow, we want to shrink it first real quick. So circle.animate, because every view has the animate function on it, and I'm going to pass in some animation options in here. Now you might be wondering, why don't I just start this circle out small to begin with? Well, first of all, you don't know how big the button is, so you don't know how big to start the circle. But if you set the circle's width and height to 0, it's not going to properly calculate the border radius. So that's why we have to do it this way. So here I'm going to animate the scale, and I'm going to set x and y to 0. That means it's going to shrink it down very quickly. And I'm going to set the opacity to go down to 0.4. So in reality, this opacity right here doesn't even matter that much. but I am going to start it off at 0 just so we don't have any kind of doubt or flicker. So our initial opacity is going to be 0.4, which is going to give us a slightly see-through white circle. And I'm going to have this duration set to 1, which is 1 millisecond. You're not even going to notice that. And every animation function has a then handler because it returns a promise. So I'm going to call then on it. And this is where we're actually going to do our main animation. So here we're going to do circle.animate, and I'm going to pass in some more options. Guess what? The options are going to be the same as here, so I'm just going to copy them and paste them in here, but we're just going to change the values. For opacity, I want the circle to fade out to nothing, so I want the ending opacity to be 0. The scale I want to be 2. I want that circle to grow, and I want it to double in size. And since we're starting out at the height and width of the actual button, the scale of 2 is going to completely fill the button and then some, so that's enough. And duration. This is the duration of our animation. Now this is a questionable value. So first, if you take a look at the implementations of Android and Material Design, usually this animation is about 250, but I like to slow it down a little bit for this particular animation, just so it's a little bit more noticeable. And to start off with, I'm just going to make this really long. Like, let's make it 5 seconds long, just so we can see it slowly. All right, let me save this and let's take a look. Let's tap the button and there's that circle. Beautiful. It's growing and growing and then it's gone. If I tap on this side, there we go. If I tap more, you can see that we keep getting ripples. Great. So that's working as we want it to. There is one little problem though. Every time we create one of these ripples, it creates a label and it adds it to our stack of views inside the absolute layout. So we need to clean up after ourselves. Let's do that here. After this animation completes, we're going to call the then handler, and we're going to remove the circle from the wrapper. There's the wrapper. We're going to call its remove child function, and we're going to pass in the circle. All right, let's check it out. Okay, there we go. So that's working beautifully. Now let's speed this animation up to 500 so it looks more realistic. If it's 500, now it actually looks like a material button. There we go. So wherever I tap, I get that animation happening. Now, is this going to work with multiple buttons? Let's try this out. I'm going to copy this absolute layout with the button. I'm going to paste it down here. And you know what? Let's change this from button red to button blue. I'm going to go to app.css. I'm going to create a new class called button blue. And just like before, I'm going to start out with blue, but let me tweak the color a little bit to something like that, deeper blue. And you know what? Let's add one more button outside of the stack layout. I'm going to go down here, one more button, just so that it's not on the same level as the other buttons. And let's call this one button green. And here I'll do the same thing. I'll just create a green class. Let's save all and take a look. Yeah, there we go. It works. Now I would also probably just want to add a little bit of margin here. Let's add a margin of 10 to our actual wrapper so that we space the buttons apart a little bit. We have width of 200. I can actually change that to width of 100. That way they fit on the page. And there we go. We have 3 buttons here. They all work and they all have the ripple effect. They're all different colors. Let's see if we're actually getting the tap event triggered. Yeah, it looks like the tap event is still being triggered by all these buttons. So there's the iOS button. But what does this look like on Android? I'm going to open up a new tab here and I'm going to go to our project folder and run this in Android. I'll speed this part up so that it starts up quicker. Okay, and here we are in Android. There's the button at the top. Notice, by the way, that Android already has the material button. So do you really need this on Android? You probably don't. And you can render these buttons on Android without using the effect. But since we are doing this tutorial, let's take a look at how we can fix this up so this doesn't look so ugly. What's making this button have its shape in Android and have this color and the shadow and the border is actually the border property. So if we go to the button class and we say border width equals 1, but the important one here is border color. If we set this to transparent, then we're not going to get that default looking color on Android. So here we are on Android and there are our buttons. And as you can see, we get that material effect with a ripple in it. So that still works just fine. And now our buttons are pretty consistent with that on iOS. Okay, that's it for animated ripple buttons. If you weren't able to follow along, don't worry, I'll put the code up on GitHub. The link is down below in the description. I got a question for you. Do you even care about material design type of things in iOS, or does it matter only on Android because that's the language of Android? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you're on Twitter, send me a tweet. I'm at Digitalix on Twitter. You can follow me there where I post lots of NativeScript related stuff. And make sure you subscribe to this channel to get the latest NativeScript tips, tricks, and tutorials. I'll see you in the next one.